So, based off on the last video, you probably understand that while this is a short period of time, there are a lot of changes going on. And just like politically we have big changes and moving happening, we're also going to see that in the literature and culture. And honestly, this can kind of be divided into pre-Civil War and then Civil War / post-Civil War. That once we start going to war with Charles I, it really does cause an abrupt shift in what's happening and how things are treated. So, during this time, thinking is changing. So I know we mentioned that in the last beginning of this unit, but things are starting to really take off and really move quickly. We had kind of a slow plod. Things were starting to be planted and moved on, but by this point, we are really going to get to just start sprinting through the period. So at this time, old beliefs are going to start changing and be dropped. So traditionally we believed in the idea of the chain of being and how that controls our social hierarchy. And if you've never seen an image of the chain of being, it's kind of cool to see just the way it was drawn and treated. But basically everyone's going to have their set spot. You can't move out of your spot on the chain because you depended on the people or the levels below you, but you are also obligated to the people above you. So even though you have your set spot, you are still expected to take care of people above and below you, and it wasn't supposed to be just like you're operating on your own. And so for example, the king would be the sun or a lion in this chain of being, but that's less of a metaphor and more of just an understood fact. So they are the sun. They are the highest point of this outside of God. We all have to help provide for them, but they are obligated to help take care of us as well. And so it's just an understood and accepted fact. A lot of the tragedies during this period deal with the fact that hierarchies are breaking and social and natural order dissolves. And so we have this idea that the chain of being could break, but most of the time we're kind of scared of that breaking and what is it going to look like. But it is starting to shift socially. You also have people like Francis Bacon who are arguing that we need to do controlled experiments or empirical experimentation to discover truth. So don't just assume things, don't just stumble upon something by accident, actually do some controlled experiments and make it happen. But what's really cool is at the same time we have Francis Bacon over in England doing this. We have Galileo making a telescope and looking into space and making decisions. We have some experiments going on that help us understand how blood circulates. So we're thinking about changing social hierarchy, but we're also changing scientifically, which is going to really challenge the religious views and importance in the coming periods. So also at this time, you have patrons and printing. So there's not huge changes in this period necessarily. It's kind of gradual and kind of slow, but there are some big things that pop up that I want you to recognize. So remember that patrons are expected to reward their writers well. It's not just money. Sometimes it's a home, sometimes it's services, clothing, employment, anything like that. Patrons were expected to treat those under them well, which makes sense when we think about this chain of being. Printing is still not very popular because the literary public is really small. So we have a lot of questionable pieces and pieces that don't survive the period because we're not really printing them in mass. They might be written on a manuscript to be passed around and recopied. So it's a little difficult at this time to really have a good piece that has survived and is unquestionable. So the London Stationers Company is still controlling what little printing there is, so you can't make money off of it, and it's very censored during this period up until 1640. At that point, the London Stationers Company loses the right and the monopoly on printing, and there's no longer any censorship. So that's a good thing that happens at the very end of this time period, but in the beginning, it's not. You can't make money off of it. Really, the only way you're going to kind of make money is if you're writing for an acting company, but even then you have to share that money with everybody else. Because of that, acting companies really hold on tight to their scripts, and they no longer share or print it unless it's a very hot, famous play, and then they might print it and make money off of it. But they don't share their scripts because it's like the one way they're going to really make money. And the nice thing is that James I does make theater under royal patronage, so that means they can make more money. Sometimes they've gotten to move inside to like a theater like Blackfriars, which is more like a big hall. But because originally they could focus on entertaining the wide masses, they do have to kind of pivot once James I gets heavily involved and focus on entertaining the courtly taste instead of just what everybody else wants to. This is kind of the period of top-notch theater, though. Like, we are living in the heyday, at least until about 1640. So, we have these Jacobean writers and genres. Jacobean, James, no, I can't tell you why. But we are moving away from the Elizabethan format, so like allegorical narratives, the sonnet sequences, pastoral poems, kind of leaving those behind, and we want to have short and witty poems. So highly stylized and elaborate is out, and we want short, concentrated, witty poems with colloquial or common language. What I need you to understand, though, colloquial language is not what we have necessarily today. And they may be short and witty, but it's witty enough to where you do have to use your brain. It's not like a quick witty, like you are going to have to engage with it. We also see a lot of new types of writing models pop up. You have elegy, satire, epigrams, epistles, religious lyrics, country house poems. So more genres are coming out, and we're going to write in various ways. However, prose is going to become really important. So I already mentioned to you satire. It's going to really start rising. We'll see it a lot later in the period. But prose writing is becoming popular, especially the idea of a familiar essay. So it's an essay written with a familiar tone, so like you're talking to a friend or something. Francis Bacon is really key in making that popular as he writes about his ideas. And the science mind, post Bacon's essays for generations, is impacted by this, which also leads to an overhaul of university curriculum, because if we're changing how we write and how we think, our curriculum needs to change. And English women are going to start coming out a little bit more in authorship. You need to remember, it's still going to be nobility or the gentry focus, so wealthy, landed, noble people are going to be writing, because the common person below that doesn't really have the time, nor are they educated to do so. But in 1611, for example, we have Amelia Lanier publishing poems. 1613, Elizabeth Cary, Lady Falkland, publishes a tragedy. 1617, Rachel Spite publishes A Defense of Woman, which is, we are going to dive into that a little bit more. And 1612, Lady Mary Roth writes a romance and gives the woman's experience and voice to love poems. So it's not just from the male gaze, we now have the female gaze. So women are starting to write a little bit more, and it's getting exciting and it's looking great. But it's not quite where we want it to be just yet. So then we have the second half of the period, which is 1640 to 1660. And like I said, this is right about the time the Civil War starts, and this is going to have a massive change for everyone. So, with the Civil War, the theater is decimated because James I put the theater under royal patronage, and that continues under Charles I. The theater does get targeted as part of like loyalty to the king and going back and forth. So theater is going to die for a little bit and kind of disappear. Parliament wants to get rid of abolish plays and sports because it could inspire irresponsible behavior and allow for the spreading of ideas they don't like. You're also going to lose patrons for writers because there's no court anymore, especially once we get rid of Charles I. We don't have a true court, so who's going to be patronizing, right? Also, a lot of writers of this age were royalist, which, I don't know about you, but that may feel a little surprising. So now because of there's no patrons, poets will begin to print their poems more to try to make money to pick up for that. And while I did say that a lot of writers are royalists, I do want to note that both Andrew Marvell and John Milton are not. True, really royalist, which is, those are big names in this period. Um, However, Milton did kind of stay loyal to the throne, even though the revolution doesn't quite match his ideals. Like, he's kind of like a mixed bag. He's not really a royalist, but like the revolution isn't exactly what he wants. So in the first part of poetry for this chunk, um, they early Civil War poetry was focusing on life is great. We're going to seize the day, and we celebrate the courtly ideal of the good life, good food, plenty of wine, good verse, hospitality, and high spirited loyalty, especially to the king. So very positive, very we're loving where we are. However, in the late Civil War poetry, so definitely by the 50s, late 40s, poetry shifts dramatically. It becomes a little bit more melancholy because they're facing defeat. Topics and moods have changed a little bit in terms of what we want to discuss. And now they care more about the relationships between love and honor, fidelity under duress, and like-minded friends sustaining one another in a hostile environment. So thinking about the fact that like all these writers who had been royalists, they see that defeat coming, and so like it's all about like staying strong together, and true love and true friendship. Again, prose is taking off like crazy, and there's a lot of classics that the general public may not talk about, but that made huge splashes in the way we think and do things during this period. Also, great news. I had already mentioned that women were starting to become more popular in writing in the first chunk of the period. This second half of the period, women writers continue to become even more and more popular because there's a lot of new experiences and a lot of new modes of writing that's allowing for more discussion and self-discovery as women. So that's really great news. We're going to start getting more and more, especially as we continue through the periods. This is a very popular period for literature, even though there's a lot going on, a lot of changes, things feel a little bit scary. Literature still abounds because people want to express what they're feeling and what they're going through. So we see a combination of intellect and emotion and linguistics all combining and having interesting ways of doing that. I've mentioned the wide range of topics and modes, how prose is growing as an instrument for discussion and debate and self-expression. And we're now allowing ourselves to show self-expression. And while Civil War and post-Civil War, theater is going to kind of be decimated. Remember, it was at the height of power for a long time. So as we move into this second half of the period and looking at some changes of what's coming, hopefully you can pick out some of these ideas.